November 14th, 1942. The frigid, churning waters of the North Atlantic, 400 miles east of Newfoundland, the sound of the driving, sleet-laden wind is the only constant as able seaman Michael O'Rourke, face raw and chafed, grips the icy rail of the Liberty ship SS Stephen Hopkins. Below, the 10,000-ton steel hull groans and pitches in the swell. O'Rourke, 19 years old and 3 weeks from Brooklyn, watches the convoy's perimeter, every eye-straining glance a search for the plume of a U-boat's exhaust or the pale wake of a torpedo. The convoy, SC-107, is a sprawling, unprotected flock of 33 merchant vessels, guarded by a scant 5 corvettes, ships barely larger than destroyers, their anti-submarine hedgehog projectors barely visible in the gloom. The air smells of salt, oil, and the ever-present dread that had become the merchant sailor's shadow. Captain Walter Skip Benson, a stocky man with a permanent squint etched from years in the steamship lanes, stands beside O'Rourke on the bridge wing. "Relax, lad. Just the sea talking," he murmurs, though his eyes too are wide, scanning the relentless gray. SC-107 is late. It should have met its mid-ocean escort days ago, but bad weather and confusion had left it dangerously exposed. Suddenly, a terrifying, percussive roar rips through the noise of the wind and sea. It's not the sharp crack of a distant depth charge, but a deep, sickening thud that rattles the Hopkins down to her keel. O'Rourke sees it immediately. The ship 2 berths over, the SS Goularga, a British freighter laden with munitions, is already listing hard to starboard. A colossal column of water and black smoke is blooming violently from her midsection, debris showering the dark sky. The air fills instantly with the desperate, piercing shriek of a steam whistle and the shouts of men. "Torpedo!" Benson bellows, grabbing the microphone. "Hard to port! Emergency full ahead!" The Hopkins engine room slams into action, the screws churning the water to a boil. But it's too late. From the dark heart of the squall, 3 U-boats of the Delphin Wolfpack, U-132, U-442, and U-521, have struck. They had slipped undetected past the thin escort line, and now they were among the helpless, coal-laden oil tanker flock. The battle, if it could be called that, was a massacre. Within minutes, another explosion, brighter and more devastating, erupts from a Norwegian tanker further out. The terrifying realization hits O'Rourke, searingly cold and clinical. They were not soldiers, but targets. They were the supply line, and the enemy was hunting them like seals in a barrel. This was not the glamour of war. This was just survival in a wooden box on a steel plate. The captain's hands shake on the wheel, his voice strained but steady. "Prepare for fire on the foredeck, Michael, and keep your eyes on the oil slick. They often surface for the final shot." O'Rourke swallows, tasting the fear that had now replaced the sea air in his throat. His duty was to the ship. His oath was to keep the lifeline open. But the odds, the terrible, unforgiving arithmetic of the Atlantic, were catching up to the U.S. Merchant Marine. Section 2. The unspoken pledge and the Wolfpack's harvest. The frantic zigzagging maneuver of the Stephen Hopkins failed to shake the invisible stalkers. For a full hour, SC-107 became a killing ground. O'Rourke watched, horrified, as 3 more ships, the American West Lashaway, the British Stone Street, and the Belgian Wisconsin, were struck and began to founder, their silhouettes sinking lower and lower into the mountainous waves. The corvettes, hopelessly outnumbered, darted back and forth, laying down shallow depth charges in frantic, ineffective patterns, attempting to shepherd the surviving ships while simultaneously hunting the unseen enemy. It was a chaotic ballet of destruction. Captain Benson slammed his fist onto the chart table. They're coordinated, God help us. This isn't a hit and run. It's a dedicated pack. The merchant sailors, the unarmed men with the vital cargo, knew the rules. The Navy's escort ships were forced to choose between staying with the surviving convoy and rescuing the men in the water. In the grim calculus of the war at sea, the cargo, the fuel, the steel, the food came first. The unspoken pledge of the merchant marine was that they were expendable. Their task was to deliver the goods or die trying. There would be no fanfare for the loss, no great media attention for the sacrifice of a civilian mariner. The Hopkins, despite her evasions, was a large target. At 0045 hours, the ocean erupted beneath her stern. The torpedo, fired by U-132, struck just behind the engine room. The shockwave lifted O'Rourke off his feet and threw him hard against the bulkhead. The air instantly filled with the screams of tortured metal and the deafening roar of escaping steam. The lights flickered and died, plunging the bridge into darkness save for the emergency battery lamp. "Engine room destroyed," shouted the chief engineer from the voice tube. "We're taking water fast." Captain Benson didn't hesitate. "Prepare to abandon ship. Michael, you get to the forward lifeboat. Go!" O'Rourke stumbled toward the port rail, the deck already listing at a sickening angle. He could feel the heavy vibration as the ship's momentum died, leaving them dead in the water. A perfect sitting target. As he reached the lifeboat station, he glanced back. Captain Benson was still on the bridge, the Hopkins's master, his silhouette stark against the glow of fire spreading from the stern. O'Rourke knew what he was doing. Following the grim tradition of the sea, he was the last to leave. The 24 surviving crew members scrambled into the 2 remaining lifeboats, the canvas covers tearing away in the gale. They lowered the boats into the black, tossing sea, their descent perilous. The moment the boat hit the freezing water, O'Rourke looked up and saw the final, unforgiving act. U-442 had surfaced. It was less than 100 yards away, its sharp metallic profile momentarily visible in the spray, silhouetted by the burning wrecks of the convoy. The U-boat crew was preparing to fire a deck gun into the Hopkins's waterline, the coup de grace that ensured she would sink. O'Rourke and the few men in his lifeboat watched the destruction of their ship, their temporary home, their whole world, in silent, agonizing detail. The smell of cordite and diesel fuel heavy in the air. The final shell struck with a muffled whomp, and the Stephen Hopkins groaned, her back broken. She slipped beneath the waves, taking Captain Benson and 7 other men with her. They were now adrift, 36 men crammed into 2 small wooden boats, in a sea that offered no mercy, their fate sealed by a silent agreement that the cargo was more important than the men who delivered it. Section 3. Adrift on the Iron Coffin Sea. The morning of November 15th brought no solace, only the sight of a decimated convoy and the brutal reality of their situation. The storm had worsened, and the 2 lifeboats, separated by the violent swells, quickly lost sight of each other. Michael O'Rourke was huddled under a canvas sheet in the forward boat with 15 other men, a mix of seasoned mariners, 2 Navy-armed guard gunners, and a messman no older than himself. They were 400 miles from the nearest land, Cape Race, Newfoundland, and directly in the path of the worst winter weather the North Atlantic could offer. Their supplies were inadequate. The boat contained hard biscuits, a small cask of water, and flares, all strictly rationed by the first mate, Mr. Harrison, a man whose quiet resolve masked his own despair. The immediate threat wasn't just the cold, which leached the heat from their bodies through their soaked wool uniforms, but the constant, back-breaking labor of bailing. Every wave that crashed over the gunwales brought gallons of frigid water that threatened to swamp the boat. "Keep bailing, boys. Don't stop." Harrison's voice was hoarse, punctuated by the rhythmic slosh thump of the wooden scoop. O'Rourke's hands were raw and blistered, his fingers numb. Yet the alternative was sinking into the iron coffin, the dark, sub-zero water that guaranteed death within minutes. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting levels of the horizon and the slow depletion of their meager rations. The psychological toll began to manifest in grim ways. On the third day, Petty Officer Miller, one of the Navy gunners, began hallucinating, seeing the silhouette of the Hopkins sailing just ahead of them, inviting them back aboard. Harrison had to restrain him physically, the desperation palpable. The men spoke little. When they did, it was usually a shared memory of a warm bar in Galveston or a mother's home cooking. Ghosts of the life they feared they would never return to. They learned the grim statistics later. Of the 33 ships in convoy SC-107, 15 were sunk by the Delphin Wolfpack over a 72-hour period. Of the 600 merchant sailors involved, nearly 300 men perished in what the historians would later call the Black Pit phase of the battle, the area beyond sustained air cover, where U-boats reigned supreme. Yet, the loss of merchant sailors would rarely be tallied with the same prominence as Army or Navy casualties. They were the forgotten victims of the U-boat war, their sacrifice often swallowed by the waves, and the classification of their work as civilian rather than military. On the fifth day, a flicker of hope, agonizingly brief, appeared. They spotted smoke on the horizon. A corvette, desperately seeking stragglers from the convoy, was steaming toward them. Harrison fired a flare, a bright crimson streak against the gunmetal sky. The boat changed course. O'Rourke stood, tears momentarily freezing on his cheeks, the sudden rush of adrenaline overriding the exhaustion. But the hope was snatched away by a cruel trick of the weather. A thick squall of snow blew in, blinding them instantly. When the snow passed 15 minutes later, the corvette was gone, vanished into the vastness of the Atlantic. The boat's crew slumped, the weight of their isolation heavier than before. O'Rourke settled back down, his gaze fixed on the endless, indifferent sea, understanding that only sheer, stubborn refusal to die would see them through. Section 4. The invisibility cloak of civilian sacrifice. The crew of the lifeboat endured another agonizing 5 days. The lack of fresh water was the most brutal enemy now. Salt water exposure and dehydration caused their lips to crack and their throats to seize. The men were weakened to the point of immobility, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving every precious calorie. First Mate Harrison was forced to make the ultimate choice: a single shared tablespoon of water per man per day. On the 10th day, one of the older mariners, Mr. Jenkins, succumbed. He did not cry out or struggle. He simply slipped away in his sleep, his heart failing from the cold and exhaustion. Harrison, with grim efficiency, performed the burial at sea, citing a brief prayer over the canvas-shrouded body before committing it to the deep. The act was a stark reminder of their mortality and the anonymity of their deaths. Jenkins was a merchant mariner, serving under the Warshipping Administration, a civilian in uniform, lacking the formal military status and protections of the Navy or Army. His casualty would be recorded as a loss of a civilian employee, rarely making the official military toll. This status, or lack thereof, was the Merchant Marine's darkest secret. While their losses were proportionally higher than any branch of the military, they were largely invisible to the public and the history books of the war. Throughout WWII, approximately 250,000 Americans served in the merchant marine. Of those, over 6,800 were killed at sea due to enemy action, a casualty rate of about 1 in 26. This was the highest rate of any U.S. service, yet their heroism and their ultimate sacrifice were often obscured by bureaucracy and the legal distinction separating them from combatants. For O'Rourke and his surviving shipmates, this invisibility was a painful reality. They fought a war, faced torpedoes and U-boats, but their fallen comrades would not receive the full honors, benefits, or public recognition granted to soldiers, sailors, or airmen. Just before dawn on the 11th day, a low, guttural noise broke the agonizing silence. It wasn't the groan of the sea or the shriek of the wind. It was the distinct, rhythmic beat of a diesel engine. O'Rourke, barely able to move his neck, strained to look over the gunwale. Out of the lingering morning mist appeared the unmistakable, towering superstructure of a British destroyer, HMS Rookwood, steaming almost directly toward them. Harrison, mustering his last strength, grabbed the whistle and blew a long, weak blast. The destroyer's lookout spotted the small, wretched lifeboat, a tiny wooden cork bobbing in the vast gray ocean. The Rookwood slowed, the massive warship easing carefully alongside the lifeboat. As a line was thrown down, the men, 12 souls now remaining, were hauled aboard. O'Rourke's last coherent thought before collapsing onto the deck was the comforting solidity of the steel deck beneath him. He was alive, saved not by the escort that left them, but by sheer chance in a British warship whose primary mission was chasing U-boats, not saving men. Yet, the memory of the Stephen Hopkins and the hundreds of unseen sacrifices in SC-107 would forever define the price the merchant marine paid.